So, The Acolyte have recently received quite a lot of criticism, some of it just, and perhaps some of it not so fair. There's been a lot of discussions about how it's badly written, badly directed, and how some of the, shall we say, events, scenes don't make a lot of sense in terms of the already established canon within Star Wars. And so forth. I wanted to make this video to point out some things that I have noticed with the Acolyte so far, with the 5 episodes that we have received, and perhaps you might be a little bit surprised because I don't think I have seen anyone else cover at least some of the things that I'm about to bring up. Some of the things that I have noticed with the Acolyte is how Leslie Headland and the writers are, in some sense, promoting a certain type of behavior or mindset that I think paints the Jedi and the legacy and canon that George Lucas put together through the 6 original films and the Clone Wars to some extent in a bad light. So the first thing that kind of made me think why the writers would put together this scene is when, I think it's in episode 2 or 3, although I might be wrong about this, when May and Osha run off from home to go into the forest to play. On their way back, Mother Coril catches them and notices, hey, you ran off without telling us first, it's not okay. And then when they come back home to the Witch complex home, they want spice creams. And Mother Coril is like, no, you can't have that because you've been bad kids, whatever. And Mother Anastasia says, in a quite weird tone, like the way she delivers the line of course my dear kids must have spice creams. It feels a bit off when May and Osha just ran off from home without telling anyone first, and then they are supposed to be rewarded for careless and rash behavior. Now, you might say in the comments that, oh, but Mother Anastasia said that they're just testing their boundaries. It's normal for a kid to test their boundaries, which is, fair. But would you normally do that in real life? Would you reward your kids for running off from home? Like, what message does that send? And you might say, well, this is Star Wars, it's not real life, and so forth. And, that's fair, but I think a lot of parents and kids watch Star Wars, and they might learn a couple of things from Star Wars, because Star Wars is not just lightsaber fights and spaceships, it carries deep, thoughtful lessons and meanings that we can derive from them. So even though it might seem like I'm nitpicking, it's just something I noticed, and I feel it kind of took me out of the scene a little bit. And I thought, okay, I guess. It's a common thing that happens over and over again with the Acolyte, at least for me. It's not the first example of when the Acolyte kind of ruins the immersion for me. So another thing that a lot of people have pointed out is that the Acolyte has a worse rating on Rotten Tomatoes and not a very good rating on IMDb either. And supporters of the Acolyte might say that, oh, people are just review bombing and leaving all these negative scores because they don't like that the Acolyte has a female protagonist or this and that, which I think is a bit of a shallow criticism. I think it has more to do with it than people not liking a female character. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I mean, if you were to compare the Acolyte right now on sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb, well, at least Rotten Tomatoes, you would see that the Acolyte has a worse audience rating than the Star Wars Holiday Special. Now that's saying something, because the Star Wars Holiday Special is a montage of vomit and acid and just pure confusion. Like, it's not a good piece of Star Wars content. And George Lucas himself, like, he hates it. He doesn't approve of it. He wants nothing to do with it. You can't really fault him for that. And the fact that people voice their opinion now about how the Acolyte is not necessarily living up to expectations, because Star Wars fans, they can be quite demanding, but it has to do with how the writers and directors are handling the already existing canon, the material that we already know and love, and the new material that we are presented, and how it doesn't blend together that well. You can call it review bombing all you want, but I think there's a slight truth to the major disappointment that a lot of fans feel these days, and some of that is justified. I think that if you don't let people know that you dislike something, then no changes will occur. They might just keep doing the same stuff that they have done previously, and the only feedback that they get is from the supporters. If you dislike something, that doesn't mean that you should attack people personally. You should never do that. But there should be a tolerance and acceptance for receiving and dealing with constructive criticism. Looking at the Acolyte receiving criticism, it's nothing new. If you look back at the prequels, they received quite a lot of criticism back in the day. And it's only been in, the recent years, I'd say the past 5, maybe 10 years, things have started to slightly shift. Whereas back in the day, after the prequels were released, actors such as Hayden Christensen, Ahmed Best, Jake Lloyd would receive massive amounts of criticism. And the prequels themselves as movies, George's directing, George's writing, would receive a lot of criticism. Some of it fair, and a lot of it not so fair. And it does impact people. So there is an important balance to strike between of voicing your opinion about, okay, I don't like this because this and this and that, and not necessarily have to agree with what people say. Just because someone doesn't agree with you, or is visibly upset about not liking the show or certain aspects of Star Wars, doesn't mean that they are a hateful person or that they should not be listened to or taken into account. This, I think a lot of fans who are dissatisfied with the Acolyte, they want good Star Wars content. That's it. And you could say, well, what's good Star Wars content? Which is a very fair question. And I think it goes back to what George Lucas said a long time ago. He's, answered this question a lot over the years in several interviews and so forth. Star Wars is basically the battle between good and evil. What's good, what's evil, trying to live on the light side and avoid the dark side. That's it, really. And how you go about telling a story like that is the interesting part. Now, when it comes to the main point about why a lot of fans dislike the Acolyte, I think it all comes down to how the story is presented. A lot of fans say that it's badly written, it's badly directed. Now, I think that the way Leslie Headland and the writers and the editors have constructed and edited the Acolyte is done with a clear intention. But that doesn't mean that it's helping the story, in the sense that in the first few episodes, we have seen a lot of characters. We have been presented with a lot of characters, quite a few planets, environments, and so forth. You know, our main character, two main characters, May and Osha. And it's a lot of info to take in. It's a lot of things going on at the same time. And I think we as an audience are not able to properly connect with all these characters and the environments because we're jumping back and forth so much and we're not able to fully invest in the characters. Now, episode 1, The Phantom Menace, also suffered from something similar in a rough cut or early version. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the scene that I'm thinking about from the behind the scenes or featurette making of episode 1, where George and Ben Burt and the others in the editing suite, Cinema, were contemplating and discussing how to make the movie more digestible for the average viewer, for the average person.
It's bold in terms of jerking people around, but I may have gone too far in a few places. I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, and the tricky part is you almost can't take any of those pieces out of there now, because each one kind of takes you to the next place, and you can't jump because you don't know where you are.
After watching that, I would say that the Acolyte may suffer from something similar. It also means to really try and not break the already pre-existing canon and story from what we already know through episode 1 to 6, the Clone Wars, etc. If we are trying to rewrite the canon and Star Wars with every passing project, it will just feel like an incoherent mess, almost like the holiday special show, where it doesn't really feel like Star Wars at times, but it still is Star Wars, so you get that sort of unfortunate confusion. I mean, another thing is how, for example, some of the top Jedi Masters, we don't really get to see that much of. You know, Master Indara, Kelnaka, Torbin. We get to see a lot of Master Sol, obviously, because she's more connected to Osha. But all the other Master Jedis, we get almost no screen time from. And you might say, well, some of them are more like background characters, or, you know, not as important, or going back to what I mentioned about how the story is sort of laid out and constructed in a way that we're jumping back and forth. So we're starting off by not giving a proper introduction to the characters, which means that the audience are not able to be invested in them from the start. So they might ask themselves the question, well, why should I care about all these characters and these environments? And you don't really get the answer to that before episode 5 or 6 or 7, which means a lot of people will lose interest and they might feel that sort of dissonance, or they might not feel as interested in the story, which I think is where a lot of the disappointment comes from. Take Master Torbin, for example. He's a top Jedi. He's secluded himself in this force bubble for like 10 years. He's meditating, he's not talking to anyone. Why is he doing that? Yeah, we're not gonna tell you. You have to wait like 3-4 episodes in from that point before we tell you. Which, you know, it's a conscious editing choice, which is fine, but I get the feeling that Leslie Headland are trying to paint the Jedi in a certain way. Now we see that specifically in episode 5, the most recent episode, and we also see it in episode 4 about how Ki-Adi-Mundi and that whole, you know, shitstorm unfolded. Basically, there's a discussion about why Jedi Masters are dying and what sort of action they should take to figure out this conspiracy or whatever chaos the Jedi are met with. And Ki-Adi-Mundi says in that episode he believes that the Jedi Council should be informed. You could say that Ki-Adi-Mundi shouldn't even be there, he's too old, whatever, he's not even born yet. That's one thing. What I noticed is how Ki-Adi-Mundi actually says that he wants to inform the council, which is a fair and justified reason. It's Master Vernestra who says, no, I think we should keep this quiet. I think we should not inform the council because that would create too much fear and tension. Which, it's a fair argument to make, but at this point in time, the Jedi are supposed to be at the height, the very top of their influence and power. I think that they could handle that fairly well, given that there's no clear evidence at that point to the Senate being corrupt, or that there's a Sith about, or that it's going to cause more fear and chaos than it would, say, during the Clone Wars. So, is Ki-Adi-Mundi really the fault here? I think it's Master Vernestra. She's the one who seems arrogant and, at fault in some sense. But this is just my opinion, but I feel the way that Leslie Headland have decided to paint this story, it seems like she wants to tell us that the Jedi are bad and that the Jedi are arrogant and, full of themselves, which I think is a bit unfair. I think that just because Master Vernestra is a bit too cautious or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the Jedi are like that, Now, there is something to be said about Master Sol, and how there seems to be, some tension or conflict related to the fire and explosion or whatever on Brendok all those years ago, and how he seems to be hiding something, and that he's got more darkness in him. I don't know. It's all part of how she has constructed this story, which leaves you to think that, so the Jedi aren't good guys, and they're doing a lot of bad stuff. Now, obviously, the Jedi are not perfect. No one is perfect, right? But I feel it goes again all the way back to what George Lucas said all those years ago during the prequels. The Jedi are, good, and the Sith are bad, and that's pretty much it.
Well, good guys are green and blue, bad guys are red. That's just the way it works.
But I suppose Leslie Headland doesn't like that interpretation. Now, in episode 5, the most recent episode of The Acolyte, spoilers ahead for episode 5 if you haven't seen it, but basically May tells Osha that the Jedi have brainwashed Osha and that they're trying to turn her against her. Sounds familiar?
The Jedi turned against me. Don't you turn against me?
Right after May says that, she immediately goes into, I love you, and trying to pull at Osha's heartstrings, Quite manipulative. Almost like how a Sith would approach someone to get what they want. Now, how is that not manipulation and brainwashing as well? If Osha wanted to go with the Jedi, then so be it, that's her choice. Even though May wants to be with Osha, she can't necessarily control her sister's life, Now, you could make a case for how the Jedi, they take children to be taught and raised as Jedi from a young age. How that is not manipulation as well. Yeah, you could argue about that to some extent, but then you would also have to agree about how May is trying to manipulate Osha into staying and not do what she wants to do. So it becomes this tug of war that no, the Jedi are bad, the Jedi are evil, and the Jedi are wrong, but May is right, well, at least in her point of view. Now, furthermore, May mentions to Osha that the life of the Jedi is a life without purpose and a life without family, which I think couldn't be further from the truth, because as Anakin says in Revenge of the Sith during the opera scene with Palpatine, the Jedi are selfless, they only care about others, whereas the Sith relies on the strength of the self, that they are selfish. Now again, I might just be nitpicking here, but this is another instance, another example of how it feels like the show is trying to sort of push me in one direction and say that this is wrong, this is right, this is how it's supposed to be. Which in some sense I feel is a bit manipulative, but you make up your own mind. Now finally, I just want to mention the idea of people who say that you're a bad person, or that you're an ist or phobe of some kind. for criticizing the Acolyte or Star Wars. That's not necessarily the truth. I don't think people hate the Acolyte because there's a female protagonist, a female lead role, or that they are of color, or that there's so much diversity in Star Wars. Why? Well, Star Wars has always been about diversity. You know, Star Wars is mainly made up of droids and aliens, and, you know, going all the way back to the original trilogy, you have Princess Leia, who's a girl, and she's leading the rebellion, so she's a female lead. And you also have the same with Padme in the prequel trilogy, also being a leader and a senator. And you have great characters like Lando Calrissian being of color. So I really don't feel like that is quite a plausible argument for why people are not allowed to criticize the Acolyte. That being said, I want to close the video off by saying, when you debate something or argue about something online, you should not put all your attention towards trying to expose someone's weakness. You should also try to highlight someone's strengths, what they're good at, to show that you understand them, you're listening to them, etc. There's a couple of things that the Acolyte does quite well, I would say. That being the set design and the costumes. Now, the sets that the characters, the actors, walk around on are, I think for the most part, quite contained, quite small. Some of them might be large, but you don't necessarily think about the actors standing on a fairly small set or an enclosed space, where at a certain point the physical set stops and you have an LCD or LED screen that acts as the background, which is, you know, props to Lucasfilm and the team for making that seamless. If that didn't work and you noticed that, oh, they're standing on the world's smallest green screen stage, you would, as I mentioned previously, be taken out of the scene. But in this case, it feels like, for the most part, as if the characters are actually in that space, and you believe that yes, Osha and May and all the others are actually in that forest. Another thing is the lightsaber fight in the most recent episode, episode 5. It was choreographed quite well, actually. You get to see the Sith, Kimir, is that his name? Do some fancy moves, the Jedi as well. We actually get to see quite a lot of Jedi die on screen in some quite creative and interesting ways, which highlight the power of the Sith, that, you know, he's not someone to be trifled with, which I appreciate, that you have the power dynamic between weak or weaker Jedi and a strong Sith, but it's still a fair competition. Like the Sith, he's not completely steamrolling the Jedi, you know, it's a somewhat fair competition, which makes for a more dynamic and interesting fight, I think. So that's nice. And another point is the sound design and music. Something that I believe Lucasfilm and Skywalker Sound are quite consistent at is solid sound design and solid music. You know, George Lucas once said that sound is 50% of the picture of the movie-going experience. Whether you believe that to be true or not, I do believe that sound is quite important to immersing the audience and making them believe that this world is actually alive. So props to the team at Skywalker Sound for that, and the composer, and the DP, the director of photography, the lighting, you know, the entire crew working tirelessly on this production. Really well done. So yeah, those are my thoughts about the Acolyte so far with the 5 episodes we have got. What did you think? Some of it is quite controversial, some of it is more believable than others. I think that we now see a slight turning point with episode 5 being, you know, better than what we received before. Things could change. You know, the show is already done, you know, they're not doing reshoots just because fans are upset. So let's hope that the Acolyte can improve with the last couple of episodes and not just exist to please and satisfy fans, but exist to deliver and present a believable story in a way that utilizes all the storytelling aspects in an intriguing and creative way, that being sound, music, lighting, camera work, set design, costume design, writing, directing. Who knows? Things might change, things might not change. What will change is hopefully our opinion about it. So what did you think? Let me know down in the comments below, and let's have a chat about Star Wars, and let's hope that the next episode is quite good.